When a billionaire defies his family's expectations and proposes to a homeless woman he hired as his date, he thought he was just following his heart. But what he didn't expect was the explosive fallout that would follow. As their love faces society's harshest judgments, can they overcome the odds? You won't believe how this story unfolds. Subscribe now to see if love conquers all. Ethan Anderson sat behind the wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, eyes fixed on the winding road leading to his best friend's wedding. Despite the luxurious car, his tailored suit, and the gleaming ring on his finger, he felt the weight of something missing. He had everything that money could buy: a booming business, a sprawling mansion, endless luxury at his disposal, but none of it seemed to matter tonight. His phone buzzed, lighting up the dashboard. It was his mother. He already knew what was coming. "I hope you have a date for the wedding. There are so many beautiful women who would love to be your date, Ethan." He rolled his eyes. It wasn't the first time his family had pressured him into settling down. His mother had gotten worse lately, and she had already picked out half a dozen suitable women who came from wealthy, established families. Women who fit the mold of what Ethan was supposed to want. But he wasn't interested, at least not in any of them. The thought of a life filled with endless dinners, high society gatherings, and transactional conversations made him feel suffocated. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was just playing a part, following a script written for him by generations of Andersons before him. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from his friend Adam, the groom. "Can't wait to see you, man. You bringing a date?" Ethan sighed and hit send on a quick reply. "I'm almost there," completely ignoring the question about a date. As he neared the wedding venue, something caught his eye. A woman sitting on the curb outside a small cafe. She looked out of place, a little ragged but undeniably beautiful. Her clothes were worn, her face framed by messy hair, but there was an undeniable strength in her posture, a quiet grace that seemed to pull him in. He found himself slowing down. He had never been one to make impulsive decisions, but tonight felt different. Something about the woman's presence stirred him, a stark contrast to the glossy, polished people he was about to face at the wedding. His mind raced, considering the ridiculousness of it. But in that moment of frustration, he knew what he had to do. He pulled up beside her, rolled down the window, and cleared his throat. "Hey, you look like you could use a meal. And, a fresh start for the night." Ethan's words sounded strange even to him, but there was no turning back now. The woman's eyes widened, and she stared at him, silent for a beat. "I'm sorry. Did you just offer me food?" she asked, her voice steady, though there was an edge of curiosity to it. "Yeah, and more. I'm heading to a wedding, and I'm, sort of stuck without a date," Ethan said, already regretting the entire conversation. He could feel the absurdity of it all, yet something inside him pushed him forward. "If you're interested, I can pay you. I'll get you a dress, freshen you up, whatever you need. I just need a date so that my friends can get off my case for a night, please." The woman studied him for a long moment. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of suspicion. Then, to his surprise, she stood up, dusting off her tattered jacket. "You're serious?" she asked, her tone both wary and intrigued. "Dead serious. I promise you you'll have a great time. The food will be endless, the drinks, well, you'll have a beautiful time." She shook her head with a slightly confused smile. "You really must be desperate if you're asking someone like me." Ethan smiled back, feeling the tension in the air shift. "Desperate enough to offer a deal you can't refuse. Name your price." The woman eyed him for a moment longer, as if weighing her options. Then, with a quiet nod, she agreed. "All right, I'll go. But on two conditions. You won't treat me like a charity case, and I won't take any handouts. The food and drink is a good deal. We'll make this a fair exchange." Ethan nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief flood through him. Deal. As they drove toward the private salon, Ethan glanced over at her. Her face was undeniably charming, which was one of the things that had caught him completely off guard. He noticed that eyes were scanning the street, distant, as though she were already somewhere else. He could see the sharpness in her features, the way she carried herself despite her obvious hardships. Her hands were calloused, her nails chipped, but there was a quiet dignity in how she held her posture. like someone who had learned to survive, no matter the circumstances. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Lena," she replied, turning to him briefly with a faint, guarded smile. "And you?" "Ethan." She nodded, staring out the window again. "This is quite the ride for someone like me," she muttered, mostly to herself. Ethan wasn't sure if he should say anything more, but he felt compelled to respond. "Yeah, well, I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing, but here we are." Lena's gaze flickered to him again, a raised eyebrow suggesting she knew more than she let on. "So why me?" He hesitated, considering the question. "I don't know. I guess I just made a spontaneous decision, and I think you're beautiful. Plus, I wasn't looking for perfection or someone to fit a mold. You're real. You're not pretending to be something you're not." Lena chuckled softly, a glimmer of warmth in her eyes. "That's a first." They pulled into the private salon, where she was immediately whisked away by stylists who began working their magic. Ethan watched as they transformed her from a woman who had been living on the streets into someone unrecognizable, dressed in a stunning gown, hair freshly done, makeup that even made her prettier. As she emerged from the salon, Ethan couldn't help but feel a spark of attraction. She was beautiful, undeniably so, and in that moment, he realized he was staring and smiling sheepishly. There was something else, something he couldn't put into words. "You look amazing," he said, almost in disbelief. Lena gave him a playful smile. "Well, that's the magic of a good makeover." As they made their way to the wedding, the tension between them was palpable. Ethan kept glancing at Lena, the awkwardness of their first encounter still lingering in the air. Yet, there was an undeniable connection. Despite their differences, their worlds seemed to collide in a way neither could have expected. The evening stretched ahead of them, full of possibility. The hum of soft conversations filled the air as Ethan and Lena moved through the luxurious ballroom, their steps careful as they navigated between clusters of guests, draped in designer gowns and tailored suits. Ethan, despite his perfect appearance and the ease with which he'd maneuvered these types of events for years, felt a growing unease. It wasn't that he didn't belong here. He knew he did, by birthright, by wealth, by every standard his family had set. But something about the night was shifting, unsettling him in a way he couldn't explain. Lena, on the other hand, was a study in grace under pressure. She wasn't used to being surrounded by the affluence of the event, but she held herself with an unmistakable poise. She wasn't shrinking from the glances, nor was she pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was real, and Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her. Lena smiled deeply as they got to the hors d'oeuvres table. She muttered something, but Ethan couldn't quite catch it. He straightened his suit as he watched one of the guests, a woman with a platinum bob and diamonds, make her way over. "Who is this, Ethan?" she asked, the edges of her voice laced with condescension. "This is Lena," Ethan said, his voice firm. He could feel a shift, a tension in the air as Lena remained unfazed. "She's a friend. My date." The woman's lips twitched, a hint of a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh," she said, the word drawn out. "Interesting choice." Lena tilted her head slightly as if sizing her up, then met her eyes without flinching. "Interesting isn't always a bad thing," she replied with a calm, knowing smile. Ethan could hear the steel in her voice, and it was enough to make him proud, though he didn't say anything. Instead, he steered her toward a quieter corner, away from the scrutinizing eyes. "Don't let them get to you," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if it was for her or himself. "They don't bother me," she replied, glancing around the room. "I'm used to being looked at like I'm not supposed to be somewhere. I've had worse experiences, trust me." Ethan watched her for a moment, the rawness in her words tugging at something inside him. There was more to her than he had thought. He had only scratched the surface. "I didn't mean to bring you here to make you feel uncomfortable," he said, his tone softer now. She shook her head, a small, almost dismissive smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I'll survive." The evening stretched on, and despite the underlying tension, the connection between them grew. As the dinner courses were cleared, they found themselves standing on the balcony overlooking the city. "I never imagined I'd be at a place like this," Lena said, her voice quieter now, more reflective. She leaned against the railing, looking out at the lights below. "Don't get me wrong. When I was a little girl, I thought I'd be someone important, someone with power." Ethan glanced at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "So what happened?" he asked. His curiosity wasn't just for the woman beside him, but for the story that shaped her, her resilience, her drive. Lena sighed, her fingers absently toying with the edge of her dress. "Life. It's funny how quickly things can change. One day you're on top of the world, the next you're not even on the map. I survived on the streets because I had no other choice, but I've always wanted more. I just never had the right opportunities." Ethan felt the weight of her words in his chest, something raw and real in her vulnerability. "I get that," he said after a beat. "I've had everything handed to me on a silver platter, but it's not enough. It's never enough. My family, they expect me to marry the right kind of woman, someone from the right kind of family, but none of it feels real." Lena turned to him then, her gaze sharp. "You're telling me you don't want that life?" Ethan paused, the truth suddenly clear. "I don't want the life they've chosen for me. I want to live my life on my terms. But that's hard when everyone else tells you what you should want." Lena's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You've got a lot more in common with the people you try to distance yourself from than you think, Ethan." The conversation between them had shifted, no longer casual small talk. There was an unspoken understanding now, something that went beyond the surface. They both longed for something more, something beyond appearances and expectations. But for Lena, that had been the struggle of survival. For Ethan, it was a prison built by his own success. As they returned to the party, the sense of unease was palpable. It wasn't just the whispers of those who saw her as a curiosity, an anomaly in their pristine world. The tension came from the way the room felt like it was closing in on them. The glances from his family were more than just curious. They were judgmental, loaded with questions. They were a spectacle, and everyone knew it. Ethan had brought a woman from outside their circle, a woman who didn't belong. They knew it in the way she carried herself, in the way she wasn't afraid to speak her mind, in the way she didn't fit into the mold they expected. One of his cousins, a woman with sharply painted lips and eyes that could cut glass, leaned over to him as they passed by. "Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with a quiet disdain, "isn't she a little rough around the edges? I mean, you could have found someone better, don't you think?" Lena, overhearing the comment, stiffened, her jaw tightening. But it was Ethan who responded first, his voice cold and sharp. "What are you implying, Rachel?" His cousin blinked, clearly taken aback by his tone. "Nothing. She's a person, Rachel, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else make her feel less than that." The moment hung in the air, charged with the disapproval of the people who surrounded him. His family looked at him, their disbelief palpable. But Ethan didn't care. Lena, still standing at his side, gave him a look, something between gratitude and a challenge. "Thanks," she murmured. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't care what they think." He meant it. As they walked back into the thick of the event, the weight of the night pressing down on them, they both knew this wasn't just a night out. This was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, something powerful, something real. After the wedding, the days blurred together in a whirlwind of events and invitations, but Ethan couldn't shake the memory of Lena. It wasn't just the way she had looked, stunning and natural despite her situation. It was her presence, her ability to make him feel seen, understood, in a way no one ever had. And it wasn't just one evening of awkward moments and tension. It was something deeper, something real. He found himself reaching for his phone, his fingers hovering over her contact name. It felt strange, this impulse, this desire to spend more time with her. But before he could second-guess himself, he sent the message. "Lena, it's Ethan. I've got a charity event this week and I could use a partner. Would you be interested in accompanying me?" It was a straightforward invitation, no hidden agendas. Ethan, for once, wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to see her again, to talk with her, to figure out what this connection was. The reply came quickly. though there was a slight hesitation in her words. "I don't know, Ethan. I'm not sure your family would approve." "I don't care. It's just an evening out. You're more than welcome to say no, but I thought you might be interested in the event. It's something I know you'll love." Lena stared at his message for a long moment, weighing her options. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to accept the invitation. But something in her, the part of her that had spent her life surviving, not giving up, decided to give him a chance. "All right, no funny business, just the event. But I'll hold you to that promise." And just like that, their next encounter was set. The evening came, and as they met in the lobby of the event hall, Ethan couldn't help but feel the same nervousness he'd experienced at the wedding. Only this time, there was a shift, a subtle, deeper understanding between them. She looked effortlessly elegant, in a simple black dress that flowed with grace, her hair styled in a way that showed off the natural curls. Despite her surroundings, she stood out, not because she tried to, but because she was genuine, unafraid to be herself. "I told you no funny business," she joked as they exchanged a warm handshake. There was a playful glint in her eyes, the same one he remembered from their first meeting. "I'm a man of my word," he replied with a smile, the kind of smile that felt more real than the ones he gave his colleagues or his family. They entered the event together, this time not as two strangers, but as two people trying to make sense of the unlikely bond they'd formed. As the evening unfolded, they talked about everything and nothing. Her dreams of owning a shelter for those in need, his frustration with the image his family had for him. They shared laughs, confided in each other, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt comfortable. As the night wore on, Ethan began to realize something. Lena wasn't just his date. She was becoming his friend, someone he could talk to in a way he couldn't with anyone else. He wasn't pretending with her, nor was she pretending with him. They were both raw, honest, and unfiltered. He couldn't deny the growing affection in his heart. It wasn't just about her beauty or her charm. It was about her strength, her resilience. She didn't need him, didn't ask for him to save her. But there was something undeniable about the way they fit together, like two puzzle pieces that had been scattered in different parts of the world, only to be brought together when they least expected it. The next few days were filled with more events, gala dinners, charity auctions, and meetings. And every time Ethan found himself seeking out Lena. He offered her a standing invitation to be his date, no questions asked. She, in turn, started to open up more, revealing pieces of her life that were both heart-wrenching and inspiring. At one particular dinner, as they sat quietly in a corner, Lena caught him staring at her in a way that felt different than before. She smiled, but there was a hint of wariness in her expression. "You're staring," she said, her tone light, but with an edge of curiosity. Ethan blinked, realizing he had been caught in the act. "Sorry, I don't know what it is, but I feel like I've known you for years. Like we've crossed paths 100 times, even though we haven't." Lena's expression softened, but there was still a guardedness to her. "I've never been the type of person to believe in destiny or fate, Ethan. You know that." He nodded slowly, then leaned forward slightly. "I don't know if it's fate, but I know this. When I'm with you, I'm not playing a part. I'm not trying to be the perfect son, the perfect heir, the perfect businessman. With you, I'm just me." For a moment, Lena's eyes softened. She didn't say anything right away, but her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her glass, as if weighing his words. "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is, Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived my whole life making sure I never depended on anyone, not even the ones who cared. Why should I start now?" Ethan's heart twisted at the raw feeling in her voice. He understood more than she knew. "I'm not asking you to depend on me, Lena. I want to be someone you can count on. I want to be there for you, not because I'm some kind of savior, but because I care." She met his gaze, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something, perhaps the truth. Finally, she nodded, though there was still a hint of uncertainty. As they left the event that night, The city lights flickering in the distance, a new tension hung between them, one that neither of them could ignore anymore. The world around them was chaotic, filled with expectations and pressures, but in that moment, all that mattered was the quiet understanding between them, the unspoken promise that something was changing. For Ethan, the road ahead was unclear, filled with his family's expectations and the looming weight of his past. For Lena, it was about survival, but also about learning to let go and trust, even if it scared her. The path wasn't easy, but one thing was certain. They had found something in each other that was worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long time, both of them wondered if this new beginning could be something more than just a fleeting moment. Ethan had always prided himself on his ability to control his life, his businesses, his social circles, even the very narrative his family had constructed for him. But this was different. Lena was different. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he was stepping into uncharted territory. He had invited Lena for dinner with his family. The dinner had been carefully planned. His mother, who prided herself on her impeccable taste, had insisted on making sure the evening was perfect, right down to the gold-plated cutlery and the vintage wine selection. As Lena walked through the grandiose doors of his family's home, Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had imagined this moment in 1,000 ways, but none of them had prepared him for the tension in the air, the way every gaze in the room seemed to freeze when they landed on her. Lena looked beautiful, but there was no escaping the judgment that hung over her like a cloud. The contrast between her simple elegance and the opulence of the room was too stark for his family to ignore. "Ethan, darling," his mother said, her voice dripping with politeness, "you didn't tell us you were bringing someone so unconventional." Her eyes flicked briefly to Lena, her gaze lingering on her dark skin with a hint of disdain. The sharpness in her tone was unmistakable. Ethan could feel the blood rising to his face, but he kept his composure, offering Lena a reassuring smile. "This is Lena," he said, his voice steady. "She's my guest, and she's more than enough for this dinner." "More than enough?" His sister Claire chimed in, her laugh hollow. "You're serious, Ethan? This is the woman you've been spending time with? She's obviously not part of our world." Lena's eyes flashed with hurt, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on her plate. Ethan could feel the tension rising, his protective instincts kicking in. His family's stares pierced through the room like daggers. "Ethan," his father interjected, his voice low but sharp, "you can't honestly think this is a good idea. You've worked so hard to build your reputation, your image. This might destroy everything you've built. She's not a good image for the family." Lena's hand trembled slightly, but she still didn't speak. She wasn't accustomed to this level of scrutiny, and the weight of their words was suffocating. She could feel the judgment from every corner of the room, and despite her efforts to stay calm, she knew this was a battle she couldn't win. She wasn't even sure if Ethan realized what was happening. "I don't need your approval," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Lena's here because I want her here." "You don't understand," his cousin David added, leaning forward. "This isn't about approval, Ethan. This is about your future, your place in society. You're playing with fire." The comments kept coming. Comments about her skin, her lack of pedigree, her apparent unpolished composure. Ethan could see the way his family looked at Lena, as though she was something to be ridiculed, something to be fixed. The words began to blur together, and he could feel his anger rising. "No," he said, standing up abruptly. "I don't care about your image, your expectations, or your judgment. I care about Lena. She's more than any of you could ever be, and I won't let you treat her like this." His voice was louder than he intended, and for a moment, the room fell into a stunned silence. His mother looked as though she had been slapped, her mouth slightly agape, but no one said anything, and the weight of the tension suffocated the room. Lena, her face now flushed with emotion, stood up quickly. She didn't want to be the cause of this argument, and the discomfort was too much for her to bear. Without a word, she grabbed her bag and turned toward the door. "Lena, wait," Ethan called, his voice desperate as he rushed to follow her. But before he could reach her, she was already out of the house, walking briskly down the long marble hallway that led to the front door. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and he couldn't bear the thought of her leaving like this, thinking that he hadn't fought for her enough. "Lena!" he called again, now outside. He found her standing near the driveway, her back to him, arms crossed tightly around herself. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice softer now, filled with sincerity. "I didn't expect this. I didn't want you to feel like this was your fault." Lena turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "I didn't come here to be the center of some kind of spectacle, Ethan. I'm not your charity case or your... I don't even know what I am to you anymore. You're not a case, Lena. You're everything I've been looking for. I've never met anyone like you." She shook her head, biting her lip to stop the tears from falling. "You don't get it. You don't know what it's like to always be judged by the color of your skin or where you come from. I can't fit into your world, Ethan. I don't belong in it." "You belong in my world," he said, stepping closer. "I want you in it, and I'll fight for you no matter what it takes." Lena looked at him for a long moment, the rawness of her emotions making her hesitate. But in that silence, Ethan made a promise, one that, despite the challenges ahead, he would keep. The days after the dinner had been suffocating for Ethan. He tried reaching out to Lena, sending texts, calling, even showing up at the park where she often spent her time. But each attempt felt like another wall being built between them. Lena had always been strong, independent, but now she seemed to retreat into herself, distant and cold, as though she was avoiding him on purpose. He couldn't understand it. The woman he had fought for, the one who had made him feel alive in ways he never expected, was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know why. A week passed before he finally found her in a small, quiet cafe she liked to frequent, tucked away from the world. It was a place that smelled of freshly ground coffee beans and cinnamon, a world far removed from the lavish restaurants and elite circles he'd become so used to. Lena sat at the far end of the room, her back to the window, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. The sight of her, so vulnerable in the quiet simplicity of the place, made Ethan's heart ache. "Lena," he said softly as he approached. She didn't look up at first, her hands frozen in mid-motion, as if the action itself was enough to shield her from the reality that awaited her at the table. "I didn't want to make a scene," she said quietly, still not meeting his eyes. "But I can't do this, Ethan. I don't belong in your world." "I've told you before, I want you in my world," he said, sitting down across from her. It's hard for me to understand why you're pushing me away now." "I'm not pushing you away," she replied, finally lifting her gaze. There was sadness in her eyes, but also something that seemed resigned. "I'm just being honest. You don't know what it's like to always be on the outside, to be judged before you even open your mouth. You look at me and see someone who could be your savior, but I can't change who I am. I can't pretend to be something I'm not." Ethan swallowed, his own insecurities gnawing at him. "I don't see you as some kind of project, Lena. I see you as..." He paused, unsure of what words could possibly convey what he truly felt. "As someone I care about. Someone I want to be with." "You want to be with me?" Lena's voice was low, almost bitter. "Or do you want to prove something to yourself? Maybe that you can save someone like me. Maybe you think you're doing me a favor by making me a part of your world. But the truth is, Ethan, you're the one who needs saving. You're the one who can't escape from your perfect little bubble of expectations." The sting of her words hit him harder than he expected. "That's not fair," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I've never treated you like a charity case. And if you think that's what I'm doing, then maybe I've made a bigger mess of this than I thought." Lena's gaze softened slightly, but she still looked distant, lost in a sea of uncertainty. "I don't know how to fit into your life, Ethan. You come from a world where everyone is someone, where every move is calculated. And I've spent so long fighting just to survive. I don't know how to live like you do." He could feel the pressure of his own doubt creeping in, fed by the constant barrage of messages from his family and friends, all telling him he was making a mistake. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his own self-doubt. "Maybe I've been living in a world that doesn't make sense, but I want to change that. I want to build something real. With you." She shook her head slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "It's not just about what you want, Ethan. It's about who we are. I'll always be from the streets, and you'll always be the golden boy. No matter how much we care about each other, there are things that will never change." There was a long pause. Ethan's heart was racing, the words spilling from his lips before he could stop them. "I don't care where you come from, Lena. I care about who you are. And I don't want to lose you because of all the shit that's been thrown at us. I'm not going to let anyone or anything tell me who I can or can't love." The silence between them stretched on, and for a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. Two souls, caught in the midst of a storm, neither could control. Lena finally broke the silence, her voice shaky but strong. "I've never had anyone fight for me before, Ethan. But I can't be the one to carry you through all of this. You need to figure out who you really are. Not who your family wants you to be or who the world thinks you should be, just who you are." Ethan's chest tightened. "And who am I?" She smiled softly, a hint of warmth in her eyes. "You're the one who has to figure that out, but you can't do it by holding on to everyone else's expectations. You need to figure out what matters to you." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of clarity, a spark of hope that had been buried beneath the weight of all his doubts. "I'll figure it out, but I'm not giving up on us." Lena didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he might actually be heading in the right direction. The days following their heart-to-heart talk were filled with a quiet tension. Ethan and Lena didn't rush into anything. They moved forward cautiously, allowing their bond to strengthen at its own pace. It wasn't easy. The weight of their different worlds still loomed over them, but it didn't feel as suffocating now. They had talked about it all, their struggles, their fears, their dreams for a future that seemed so unlikely, but no longer impossible. For Lena, it wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about breaking free from the chains of her past, the constant struggle to survive, the bitterness of being an outsider. Ethan wasn't like the others. He wasn't trying to fix her or make her fit into some perfect mold. He saw her, really saw her, and in him, she found something she hadn't expected: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her in a world far bigger than the one she'd known. One evening, after a long walk through the city, Ethan looked at her with a strange determination in his eyes. They were sitting in his penthouse, the same place she'd once felt so out of place, but now there was a sense of ease between them. He couldn't hold back any longer. "I'm done pretending, Lena," he said, his voice low but steady. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I don't care about my family's expectations. What I care about is you." Lena looked at him, unsure where this conversation was heading, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. She held her breath, waiting for him to continue. "I know it's too soon," he said, standing up from the couch and pacing a bit. "But I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I want you to be a part of my life, not just as my date, but as something more. I want to be with you, Lena. I want us to build something real, something that's ours, something that no one can take away." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She knew what was coming, but it still felt like a dream. "Ethan!" Before she could finish, he dropped to one knee, the gesture so spontaneous that it almost felt surreal. "Lena, will you marry me?" For a moment, Lena froze, her mind racing. Was he serious? Was this a joke? A part of her wanted to laugh, to tell him he was being foolish, but when she saw the look in his eyes, she knew it wasn't. You're serious?" she asked, her voice shaky but filled with awe. He nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. "I'm serious. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The laughter bubbled up inside her then, a mixture of disbelief and joy. "Ethan, this is crazy." He grinned, standing up and pulling her into his arms. "I know, but I don't care. I'm done playing by the rules. I want this, Lena. I want you." She hugged him tightly. the warmth of his embrace filling her with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ethan's smile widened, and he kissed her forehead, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "We'll figure it out, Lena. Together." The rumor of Ethan's proposal spread quickly, first among their friends, then to the press. His mother called the next day to voice her disapproval. "I told you this would happen," she fumed to Ethan over the phone, her voice tight with anger. "This is just a stunt, a way to get back at me. I won't stand for it. You won't go through with this. You can't." Ethan's patience was wearing thin. "Mother, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you how it's going to be." His mother's voice dropped to a cold, venomous tone. "You think you'll be happy with someone like her? Do you honestly think she's good enough for our family? She's nothing but a charity case, a distraction. She doesn't belong in our world, Ethan. And neither do you if you're going to make this mistake." "Enough, Mother," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I'm done letting you control my life. I'm not going to back down just to please you. I've made my decision. Lena and I are getting married, and that's final." He hung up before she could respond, the weight of her words hanging in the air long after the call ended. Meanwhile, Lena was still trying to come to terms with what had just happened. She hadn't expected this, had never imagined she would find herself in a world so foreign to her, especially with someone like Ethan. But as much as her heart jumped at the thought of building a future with him, the reality of their situation was still uncertain. His family's rejection stung, but Lena wasn't about to let them define her worth. She had spent her whole life fighting for survival. She could handle this. "I'm not scared of them," she whispered to herself, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman who had come a long way from the streets. "And I'm not scared of anything anymore." As days passed, Lena couldn't deny the mounting pressure. It wasn't just the whispers behind his back or the judgmental glances from his family. It was the world, the media, the expectations placed on him as a billionaire, the heir to a legacy that demanded conformity, wealth, and tradition. But Ethan couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't let his family's narrow view of the world define his happiness. And more importantly, he couldn't keep hiding the woman who had changed everything for him. Lena was his heart now, and he wasn't about to let anyone dictate that. He had been toying with the idea of a public proposal for days, a grand gesture that would show his family, his friends, and the world that Lena was not a passing infatuation. She was the one. The woman who had opened his eyes to a life worth living. The one who had made him believe in himself again, despite the overwhelming weight of expectations. And so, he made the decision. Ethan had planned everything meticulously. A rooftop event overlooking the skyline, the perfect backdrop of glittering lights, and a sky full of stars. Guests, reporters, and photographers had been invited under the guise of an event he was hosting. Only a select few knew what was really coming. When Lena arrived at the event, she felt out of place. The lavish atmosphere, the extravagant decor, the clinking of glasses. It was everything she had once thought she would never be part of. The coldness of high society had always made her feel like an outsider. And tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. But then she saw him, Ethan, standing there with that familiar warmth in his eyes, waiting for her. He took her hand gently, his touch grounding her in a way no one else ever had. "You look beautiful," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise of the room. "Thank you," she replied, offering a nervous smile. But something was different about him tonight. He seemed more certain, more confident, and it made her heart flutter. "I need you to trust me," he said, his eyes locking with hers. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no sign of doubt. Lena felt a twinge of anxiety in her chest. "What's going on, Ethan?" He took a deep breath. "I'm about to show everyone that this," he gestured to the two of them, "isn't just a fling. It's real. And I want them to see it." Before she could protest, he led her to the center of the rooftop, where the media had gathered. The cameras flashed as they took their places, and the reporters murmured, sensing something was about to happen. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Ethan turned to the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. But there's something I need to say. Something most of you might not know. This woman, he gestured to Lena, has changed my life in ways I never thought possible. She's taught me what it means to live authentically, to embrace who I truly am, and to stop pretending that I have to live by anyone else's rules. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard him speak this way. So open, so vulnerable, so sure of his feelings. She's not just some fling. She's the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with, Ethan continued, turning to face her directly. Lena, will you marry me? The words hung in the air like a weight, a declaration that shook the very foundation of everything he had known. The silence was deafening, broken only by the clicks of cameras and the gasps of those who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Lena felt the world shift beneath her feet. She looked at Ethan, his eyes filled with hope and love. She saw the man he had become, the man who had chosen her, despite all the odds, the man who had stepped into the arena of his own life, ready to fight for what mattered. But her heart was torn. This wasn't just a decision about love, it was a decision about her own worth, about the life she had built for herself, the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. Was she ready to step into this new world, one that was foreign and overwhelming, yet full of promise? She looked out at the sea of faces watching them, waiting for her response. She saw the doubt in their eyes, the whispers behind their hands. They were waiting for her to mess this up, for her to prove their prejudices correct. But then she saw Ethan's face, the sincerity in his eyes, and the love that radiated from him. She had fought for her place in this world, but maybe, just maybe, there was a place for her here too. Maybe she could build something with him, something real and full of hope. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling but strong. Yes. The crowd erupted in applause, but for Lena, it was the quiet peace that settled in her heart that mattered most. She was no longer an outsider. She was no longer running from love. She was stepping into a future with him, uncertain but full of possibility. As Ethan pulled her into his arms, kissing her gently, Lena finally understood. This wasn't just about a grand gesture. It was about choosing love over fear. It was about two people from different worlds coming together to create something extraordinary. And for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged. The days following the public proposal were a whirlwind, but beneath the surface of the media frenzy and the excited buzz surrounding their engagement, something else was brewing, something more personal. Ethan and Lena's lives had irrevocably changed, and not just because of their engagement, but because they were beginning to see how the world around them viewed their love. For the billionaire's family, the shock had not yet worn off. His mother, especially, was in disbelief, her mind spinning at the idea of her son marrying someone who, according to her, was completely outside the world they had so carefully built. She had raised Ethan with the belief that he would settle down with someone from the right background, someone who could uphold the family's name with dignity and status. Lena was everything she never imagined for her son. She had come from the streets, from hardship, from a world that Ethan's family could never understand. And yet there she was, his fiancée, standing proudly by his side. But as time passed, something unexpected began to change in Ethan's mother. Her initial anger and disbelief were soon replaced by a more subtle realization. She had never seen Ethan this happy before, not since his early years when he had been full of dreams and aspirations, before the weight of the family business and expectations had clouded his joy. With Lena, her son was vibrant, confident, and alive in a way she hadn't seen in years. One evening, as she sat alone in the quiet of her grand home, she found herself reflecting on everything she had judged in Lena, the woman who, against all odds, had captured her son's heart. Maybe, just maybe, Lena wasn't the threat she had first appeared to be. Maybe she was the catalyst Ethan needed to break free from the stifling world they had built for him. When she finally spoke to Ethan about it, there was a vulnerability in her voice that had never been there before. "I didn't think I could ever accept it, Ethan," she said softly, her hands wringing together in her lap. "I didn't think I could accept her, accept this. But seeing you with her, Seeing how she makes you feel, I can't ignore that anymore." Ethan looked at his mother, surprise and gratitude in his eyes. He had never expected this conversation to happen, especially not after all the resistance they had faced. "You're not the only one who's had to adjust, Mom," he said, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "But I need you to understand something. Lena isn't just some girl I've fallen for. She's everything to me, and I want her to be part of this family, no matter how hard that might be for all of us." His mother nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I was wrong. I was so wrong," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I should have seen it sooner. You deserve this happiness, Ethan. I'll try. For you." And just like that, the walls that had once been so rigid began to crack. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't without effort or more difficult conversations. But little by little, the family began to realize their mistakes. They had spent so long adhering to expectations that were no longer relevant, no longer needed. The notion that they could define love by money, status, and appearance had become obsolete in the face of Ethan and Lena's connection. Ethan's father, who had been equally reluctant, found himself slowly warming to the idea. The more he saw his son's transformation, the more he understood that this wasn't just about rejecting family values. It was about building something new. His admiration for Lena grew, not because of her past, but because of the strength and resilience she had shown, the way she had fought for her survival, the way she had held her head high in a world that had never been kind to her. It was something that earned his respect. But the real turning point came when Lena was invited to a family gathering for the first time since the engagement. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Would the family accept her, or would it be another tense confrontation? As Lena entered the room, she couldn't help but feel a flutter of nervousness. The judgment, the silent stares. She was all too familiar with that feeling. However, something was different this time. Instead of whispers, there were greetings. Instead of cold shoulders, there were smiles. Ethan's mother approached her first, taking her hands in her own, her face softening with genuine warmth. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice steady. "I'm sorry it took me so long, but I'm truly happy for both of you." Lena blinked, overwhelmed by the sincerity in her voice. For a moment, she felt as though the world had shifted. Not just her world, but the world that had once looked at her as something beneath them. She smiled, her heart full. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying more weight than she could express. As the evening wore on, it became clear that the family was beginning to understand. They were slowly breaking down the walls they had built around their own hearts, walls made of pride, wealth, and preconceived notions. They were learning to embrace Lena for who she was, not for her past, not for her background, but for the woman she had become. And that was all that mattered. Love defies all odds when we dare to follow our hearts. For another story that inspires and uplifts, click the video to the left. And if you believe in the strength of love and second chances, subscribe to be part of this incredible journey. See you next time.